So now that we have finished the book Night, I want to just talk a little bit about how Elie Wiesel actually structured his story, because coming to the climax and resolution of any story is often the most difficult part. We aren't quite sure a lot of the times how to transition from one place to another, and so what we're going to do is actually use Elie Wiesel's story as an example of how we can do that in our own writing. Okay. So we've already covered a little bit of the beginning and middle. Last time we looked at this specific chart, we were right about here with those rising actions. We still had a lot of stuff going on. We had identified that the something that happens, that conflict, is them being moved into the ghetto, and it's really representative of the larger conflict of confinement and losing freedoms. So the overall conflict of the story is this trying to get freedom back and longing for freedom. So once they are moved into the ghettos, that is like the real start of this conflict. And everything that happens beyond that is trying to survive. So when we're looking at these rising actions, all of this stuff that happens to Elie Wiesel and his father is them trying to survive, them trying to get through and kind of get to this end goal of freedom again. Okay, and so that's the entire middle of this story. And then we kind of had a couple of different moments of kind of peak intensity as far as the conflict goes. There were several instances where, when people were being killed or people were being moved to infirmary or the bombings from the Allies. All of those were pretty like high intensity in terms of like the change of tone for the story. But when we're talking about the climax, we're talking about in relation to the conflict being resolved. Okay. Here it says rock bottom. So at what point did Elie Wiesel hit rock bottom? Spoiler alert, if you haven't finished the book yet, pause and finish first. The rock bottom for him was when his father died. Okay, so they had been working this whole time trying to just get to survival, get to this freedom, and then his dad died, right? And then he kind of he says that he's not even going to talk about the next couple of months of his life in the camps because it's not worth mentioning. Nothing happened. So you've got that rock bottom, and then things are still going on. He is still in the camp. Um, but then once we see some liberation, once we see them packing up camp and trying to move everyone out, that is that's kind of like the second momentum, the climax really for the conflict itself. So we see that there are a couple of different really big shifts here. His dad dies, and that's the rock bottom for him. And then he continues on until there's talk of liberation. And that is the peak moment in dealing with the conflict. Okay. Because they're like, wait a second, this is actually potentially real. Like people are starting to really freak out. We can tell that this is like the front is close. That's the true climax for the conflict. And then everything that happens in the next like 2 pages, page or two really, with people being freed and then like them just being left behind and then the allies coming in, those are all the falling actions, and it happens so fast. Once there is this, yes, we're going to get liberated, people are coming, everything happens really, really fast. So even though a lot of the times it's identified that like we've got these rising actions and then we've got these falling actions, they are not equal to each other. The rising actions are most of the book. The falling actions are like maybe 2% of the book. So everything happened really, really quickly. And then the resolution is he was free. We have a little bit that happens after he's actually liberated from the camp. So that is that denouement. That's the new status quo. So he is freed. He is taken from the camp. They are given food. That is the resolution. If it were to just stop there, we wouldn't really see the impact that kind of everything had on him and his mentality, because he ended up getting like he had some poisoning and ended up spending a few weeks in the hospital. So even after he was just freed from death camps, he almost dies. Like that's what it was probably the most serious for him. And then we see at the very end, he says that a skeleton was, or a corpse was looking back at him, because that was the first time he had seen his own reflection since he was moved to the ghetto, or moved from the ghettos. So that denouement is really important because we're seeing like what is he coming to terms with, or what is he now noticing now that he's removed from that situation. Okay. So this week we saw a lot, even though it was probably the shortest collection of reading. Everything that happens right around and after that climax is really quick. We learn a lot of new things, and things happen at a very quick pace. So we are now done with night. Um, the goal is to look at how Elie Wiesel structured his story, and sorry about that. Look at how he structured his story and then kind of mimic it. So on Monday and Tuesday, this was posted for you to map out Elie Wiesel's book, looking at that, the plot structure. So identify the exposition, initial conflict, rising action, climax, falling actions, resolution, and denouement. Okay, so identifying what those are. I just walked us through most of that. Should have already had that done, because we are going to use that and we're going to use that and kind of try to mimic that in our own writing. So we should have at least the first three of these parts of the plot organized and created for our story already. Um, Ideally, this next week, we would spend finishing our story, kind of getting that wrapped up. Um, so once you've mapped out what he did for his story structure, try to mimic that as far as about how much time he had spent on each piece and the intensity of it. Now, granted, none of us have been in death camps. None of us have been um, shuttled in cattle cars from one concentration camp to another. Like he went through some stuff. Our stories will probably not be as intense, but we can still follow a similar structure. Okay, whereas it's not going to be as heavy of a topic. It can still be a similar kind of creation. Okay, a couple of things to note. If you have not yet already included a symbol in your story, please make sure that you include that. It should be identified fairly early on. So we should have already identified something that is really significant or representative to us in our stories. In the book Night, we saw it, I believe it was chapter 2. It was introduced to that concept of flames and fire, where Ms. Schachtner was screaming in the train cars, and everyone was like, "Oh, just shut her up!" And then it was foreshadowing, and then it's something that like the flames, the chimneys, and the smoke, like everything that is encompassed with the flames, is representative of death, and it comes up so much throughout the book. And even in early in chapter 2 or late in chapter 1, we see them like talking about food and how it was in abundance when they were at home, and then as time went on it was more and more scarce. So that's kind of representative of life, so it represents something more, and it comes up consistently throughout the book. So please make sure you are also including that symbol. And then one thing we haven't really touched on too much, we're going to see a little bit more of that information next week, is dialogue. So even though this story is being written from your perspective, most stories still have some interactions between characters, even if it's not a ton and like really long dialogue. Elie Wiesel includes characters speaking to one another. Even though it's his story, he still says and represents what was said between multiple characters. If you haven't included any dialogue, I encourage you, as we are getting further in the rising actions and getting to that climax, involve some of that verbal interaction between two or more people. And I'm going to talk a little bit next week about why that's so important in stories. But this is our goal: is throughout the next week, finish up our stories. Even though there are 4 pieces of plot structure remaining, that's really only like 10 or 12% of our story. So most of our story will be this rising action. Please let me know if you've got any questions, and have fun writing.